As a Chinese Australian myself, I have felt the effects of the tumultuous COVID-19 pandemic and now rising tensions within the South China Sea. What can be done to destigmatise the Chinese Australian population?
Jennifer, the Lowy Institute's done some work around this, hasn't it? Tell us what it found.
So the Lowy Institute over the last 2 years have surveyed Chinese Australians and their sentiments on living in Australia, sense of belonging, a range of geopolitical issues, and also the state of bilateral relations. And we find in this year's survey that generally Chinese Australians feel a sense of belonging, although that has decreased since 2020, a general sense of belonging, pride in Australian life and culture. And I think these are all positive indicators of Chinese Australians' contribution and integration into Australian society. But yes, I would agree with you that over the last 2 years, due to COVID and pandemic lockdown, the sense of fragmentation has happened, in part due to discrimination, racism, when you've got former presidents or leaders of the world saying it's a China virus, so really stigmatizing, giving it a geographic indicator. I think that doesn't help. It doesn't help Chinese Australians or Chinese Australian communities here. But I would say, there is potential positive points to look forward to. With the new government in power, there is signs of de-thawing between Australia and China relations. Obviously, that is all still very much on tenterhooks.
Jun, can I come back to you, just ask you, how have you experienced that? Have you personally experienced that, your family, the stigmatisation you've spoken about?
In general, I feel there's just a negative perception both in the schoolyard and in the media. And I fear that China's recent political actions will only compound this.
Because you mentioned COVID, and now, of course, we're seeing the tensions over Taiwan. Is that changing things? You say that could make it worse. Have you experienced that, seen that at all yet play out?
I do believe that it can make it worse, and I've seen certain circumstances which do show this. Yeah.
Jennifer, when you look at that, what are the sort of things that people are telling you about that they have experienced? And I don't know whether you've experienced yourself personally either.
Well, I think the last 2 years have been terribly difficult. Yesterday at the Lowy Institute, we had a Migration Nation event talking about how multiculturalism can inform foreign policy making here in Australia. And I think one of the things that is missing in Australian society is that we haven't moved beyond celebrating the demographic reality that is Australia. The census over the last 5 or 10 years showed that Australia is becoming more multicultural, but we haven't moved beyond sort of that cultural aspect. What about integrating and institutionalising the voices of multicultural communities into policy making?
James Paterson, we've had instances where Chinese people have had their loyalty questioned or asked to almost pass a loyalty test when appearing at parliamentary committees. How do we differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people who are in China, and Chinese people in Australia?
Yeah, John, thank you for raising this issue. You're absolutely right too, and I've been concerned about this for some time. One of the first public interviews I gave after I became the Intelligence Committee Chair, I said that it is both morally wrong and counterproductive for Chinese Australians to be held culpable for the actions of the Chinese government. It's also wrong to hold the Chinese people culpable for the actions of the Chinese government because they had no say in picking that government. There was no vote which brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. It's morally wrong because it's not your fault, and it's counterproductive because we want Chinese Australians to feel just as much a part of the Australian community as everyone else and to be able to fully participate in that community. And I will always defend the right of Chinese Australians or any other Australian to have the freedom of speech and to participate in public debates. Whether you share my views on the geopolitical situation or whether you completely disagree with me, you have every right to be outspoken about those issues. And to stand your point, we have to be very careful about our language. We have to be very clear that we are saying that our dispute and our disagreement is with the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China. It is not with the Chinese people, and we have to re-emphasise that at every opportunity. Because the Chinese people are rightly very proud of the achievements of their civilisation. It's an amazing culture. There's been 200 years of migration of Chinese people to Australia, and they've massively enriched our country. And so we, as political leaders, have a special responsibility to bear to make sure that Chinese Australians can participate fully in public and political and social life.
But I was just going to say, I mean, the thing, I think this is what you were raising too, is that the institutions of government and the institutions of Australia need to better reflect that diversity. I mean, even something as simple as language schools and language training, it's simply not as common to be learning other languages in Australia as in a lot of other countries. There are so many things that can be done at a very basic level for Australia to actually embrace its multiculturalism and frankly embrace the world in a way that it is yet to fully do.
俊，谢谢。我会说一点普通话，谢谢。